Going to ask that everybody please remain muted throughout the presentation. And if you do have any questions, you can either put them in the chat box or you can write them down. And after Dr. Ransom has finished his presentation, then he will try to answer all the questions, or he will answer all the questions, and also open it up to oral questions if you really want to present them to him that way. One of the ways that you can kind of make your screen a little bit uncluttered is if you go into view and check the speaker, then that will only put, once Dr. Ransom starts sharing on the screen, it'll only make what he's sharing on the screen and his picture show up on your screen, which makes it a little bit less crowded. So I'm just going to do a very brief introduction of Dr. Ransom, and then I'm going to turn it over to him. Dr. Ransom is a member of the Olympia Historical Society and interested in local history. He developed policies and programs for the protection of Puget Sound's waters habitats for the state of Washington for 15 years. He is an oral historian, photographer, and naturalist, and has published extensively on the behavior of non-human primates, marine mammals, and raptors. Using the history of the Braget farm and family, he illustrates the difficulties American society has faced in balancing its needs for public and private lands, honoring those who have maintained our open spaces. So Dr. Ransom, we're going to turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Carol, and thanks to the Historical Museum for inviting me to be with you all this evening. Thanks also, Carol, for your technical support and advice to viewers, and to my lovely wife, Melanie, who is on with us tonight and has agreed to run the slides for me. I'm sure I would crash and burn if I tried to do everything myself. So in a moment, I'm going to ask Melanie to have the first slide, but I do want to say it's nice to see some familiar faces and more names out there. And I hope those of you who know me will be kind in your reviews. Also, we want to mention that we are recording this presentation, and if all goes well, it will be put up on the museum's website for viewing by those who couldn't make it tonight if they're interested. So, okay, Melanie, can we have the first slide? All right. Oh, now I'm in trouble. Okay. I have to go back to that. Okay, great. So we are here tonight because I did recently publish The Fruits of Almost 20 Years of Labor, a book entitled For the Good of the Order, the Braget Farm and Land Use in the Nisqually Valley. And Carol's told you a bit about it. But I say almost 20 years of labor because while the project began when I met the last surviving member of his immediate family, Kenny Braget, in 2000, it took many of those years for me to decide what kind of book would result. The first few years, until his death in 2006 at age 74, excuse me, were spent getting to know Kenny, his friends, neighbors, and relatives, and also using the then still new tool of the internet to learn more about his family and the history of their dairy farm in the Nisqually Valley, including the many pioneers that had lived there. Kenny and I used to joke that I found out more about his family than he or Marceline, his mother, and a dedicated genealogist, ever knew. Eventually, the many, many hours spent listening to Kenny's stories and talking about the past with many others resulted in a 750-page manuscript, excuse me, of everything I had learned about the Braget family and farm in the Nisqually Valley. That's more than twice the size of this book, which is pretty hefty itself. But even before I started to write, I knew that I was hearing several stories. There was the story of the family of Norwegian immigrants that came to this country in 1866 and to the Nisqually Valley 30 years later, when Kenny's grandfather, Ole Braget, purchased 190 acres of land on the Delta from Ernest Surfling, who, by the way, was also a sometime resident of Steilacoom. There was the story of the two branches of the Braget family, descended from Ole's first and second wives, and how they went from being close friends to being adversaries across a courtroom table. There was also the story of the family through the ups and downs of the middle of the 20th century, trying to make their small dairy farm a success in the face of bad weather and floods, the ups and downs of local and national economies, 2 world wars, and the invasion of the hippies. And lastly, there was the story of all the other interests, the government agencies, the business interests, the conservationists and environmentalists that wanted the Braget land to be used according to their own definition of the highest and best use of it. Finally, it was that story of land use that piqued my interest as the one in most need of telling. It was one that caught my attention initially and led me to pursue the opportunity to work with Kenny and eventually to put in all those hours and years since. I'd like to tell you how I came to that conclusion by reading you an excerpt from the prologue of the book. Kenny Braget was obnoxious and loud, and definitely a loose cannon. I knew his type, one of those necessary evils of public meetings, someone with an axe to grind that tried to dominate the gathering by speaking often and at length, but rarely to the issue at hand. In the late 1990s, I was a staff member of the Puget Sound Water Quality Authority, a small state agency charged with protecting the marine waters and habitat of Puget Sound. I was a local liaison assigned to work with local governments and other political bodies, such as watershed councils. My bailiwick included Pierce County. As I started attending meetings of the Nisqually River Watershed Council, I became aware that Kenny Braget was a regular and often dominating feature of the gatherings. He was always dressed as if he had just stepped off a tractor, flannels, suspenders, and boots, and his hat invariably supported the logo of some farm implement company, like the John Deere Company or the National Rifle Association, the NRA. And when Ken got the floor or the microphone, it was all anyone could do to get them away from him. I ignored him at first, sensing that others at the table were just waiting for Ken to finish reciting a well-known litany of complaints, family and farm history, and general gripes about government intrusion, so that the rest of us could get on with business. Somewhat in self-defense, though, I began to listen to Kenny's rants, and with repetition, his stories began to take on lives of their own. As it turned out, I learned more about the way the world works from Kenny than from any other attendee at those meetings. End quote. Eventually, it came to me that I needed to use the experiences of all the Bragets in the Nisqually Valley to tell a story of the battle over who has a say about land use and how we as a society have tried to find a balance between public trust and private interest, between the best for all and the best for the one. That is the story I tried to tell in For the Good of the Order. Now, every author will tell you that the hardest part of writing a book like this is deciding what to leave out. For me, that meant setting aside most of what I had learned about the families that came to the valley before the Bragets, like the McAllisters, the Mounts, the Bennetts, and the Packwoods. It also meant omitting a wealth of detail I had gathered about the Bragets before Grandpa Ole arrived in Tacoma by one of the first trains from the East, back in the late 1880s. Things like the reasons they decided to give up their lives as tenant farmers in the Lillehammer region of Norway to emigrate to the New World, and things like what their lives were like in the American Midwest. It meant leaving out a lot about some of the most important influences on Kenny and his brother, Thomas Ward, when they were growing up. Among those influences, some of the most significant were the people and schools of Dupont. So I propose to spend the rest of our time together this evening sharing with you what Dupont, the place, the people, and the company meant to the Bragets. And there's no better way to start than my sharing with you something that Mike Morgan, who grew up in Dupont, told me a few years ago. He said, "Where else could you grow up when on a Sunday morning, after you did your papers, about 12 noon after duck hunting, there'd be 5 of us with our shotguns over our shoulders, walking right through the middle of town. You'd come back to Roy and Eleanor's place or our house. We lived on the same block. Or Norm Westby's. We'd come walking through there with our shotguns and nobody said anything. It was a good place to grow up. It was a good place to live, a good place to grow up for kids between the bay, the Braget farm, hunting golf balls on the golf course, learning how to drive on those old logging roads. You couldn't grow up in a better place. That is my view of our life here," he said. Now, I do need to back up a step because the story of the Braget involvement with Dupont began not with a Braget, but with a Welch, Thomas Welch to be exact. Born Thomas Francis Walsh in Clonmel, County Tipperary, Ireland in 1884, Tom immigrated at the age of 4 with his family to Hannibal, Missouri. After finishing school, he began his career with Dupont at a powder plant that the company had opened in 1892 near Hannibal. Not too near because, of course, they didn't want to blow up Hannibal, so it was a ways out of town. In 1906, Tom married 18-year-old Lenora Marie Gillette, the daughter of another Dupont company employee. And a year later, Lenora gave birth to Marceline Celia Welch. And Marceline, if you may already know, was Kenny Braget's mother. In 1916, Tom was transferred by Dupont to its plant in Montana, where experienced laborers were needed to make the dynamite that would keep the copper mines at Butte producing for the war effort. With the end of World War I, Dupont laid off much of its workforce, and the Welches found themselves back in Hannibal, and Tom unemployed in the winter of 1921. The following spring brought news of a boom of logging and other industries in Washington state, and of the need for skilled powder workers at DuPont's plant on the Nisqually Plain. There, Tom spent the rest of his employable years with the company. At age 16, Marceline entered Lincoln High School in Tacoma and got a job as a clerk at the general merchandise store run by Gunnar and Heine Johnson in DuPont. Bright and attractive, she made friends easily and caught more than a few boys' eyes. One of them who paid more attention to her than most was a patron of Johnson Brothers' store, the son of a Nisqually farmer, Walter Braget. By this time, almost 30 years after Ole Braget had acquired the Nisqually property, much had happened to the Braget family. After the death of his first wife, Oleva, in 1893, leaving him with 2 young sons, John and Henry, Ole married Kenny's grandmother, Matea. As Henry and John matured into young men, Ole and Matea started a second family, which would include Kenny's father, Walt, and Walt's older brother, Morris, and sisters, Mabel and Helen. The children of this second family did their early schooling in DuPont, but when Ole and Matea moved to their house in the hilltop region of Tacoma, leaving Henry and John in charge of the farm, the young children went with them and went to school there. Meanwhile, John and Henry started families of their own. John and Medora Bucknell Braget, from what later became Lacey, eventually had a brood of 12 children as John became major domo for one of the gun clubs on the slough adjacent to Ole's land. and eventually he established his own small farm just south along Mounts Road. Older brother Henry and Dorothea Braget also began a family, and it seemed likely that Henry would take over the farm when Ole retired. So now I need to look at that picture and find out how I do that. There it is, because I want to tell you more about it. This was a wonderfully unique photograph taken probably by Walter's sister, Mabel, in about 1917. Mabel was a very active photographer back in the 10s and early 20s. And this is on the front porch of the Braget farmhouse as it was back then. And to the right, in front of the post, is Ole Braget, the grandfather. And back in the middle, in a white shirt, but furthest back and small, is Matea, his second wife, the mother of Walter and his siblings. Here in front, with the suspenders on, is Henry from their first marriage, and behind and slightly to his right is Henry holding a child. Back, well, okay, and over the other woman in the back next to the post is Dorothea, Henry's wife. Now, starting from the left, for the children, John Braget is holding his second son, Elwood, and the boy with the cap on is Walter. Next to Walter's left, to our right, is Helen, and behind Helen, slightly, standing up holding a dish, they're all eating ice cream, by the way, is Henry and Dorothea's son, Orlando, the one who eventually would be diagnosed as being disabled. In front of him is John and Dora, Medora's first child, John Martin, and Medora is not in the picture. Upper right is in a vest is Morris, Walter, Helen, and Mabel's older brother, the son of Ole and Matea, their oldest child. Okay, now I need to get back to my notes. Right there. There we go. Okay. Unfortunately, a bright future was not in the cards for Henry and Dorothea. One by one, 3 of their children died at or within a few years of birth, and the fourth, Orlando, suffered from what might now be diagnosed as brain damage at birth. Then in 1919, Dorothea took ill and quickly died, one of the last victims of the Spanish flu in the region. Henry left the farm, never to return. After Henry's departure, Ole and Matea moved back to Nisqually to once again take charge of the farm. But now, turning 70 and more of an adventurer, real estate investor, and personal banker, in other words, a loan shark, than a farmer, Ole started relying more and more on his teenage sons, Morris and Walter, to run the farm, which, by the way, Ole had originally acquired to serve as a ranch for horses he was leasing out to businesses in Tacoma at the time. As soon as they could, the boys, Morris and Walter, bought Ole out and began developing the farm as a dairy, running their growing herds of cows and goats on the flats and on DuPont's unused property up on Hoffman Hill, just to the east. Once again, Ole and Matea moved back to Tacoma, leaving 22-year-old Morris and 19-year-old Walter in charge in 1923. 1 year later, Morris was dead in an automobile accident, and Walt was on his own as sole proprietor of Braget Farm. I cover Walt's early life on the farm, his courtship of Marceline Welch, their marriage, and the birth of their children, Kenneth and Thomas Ward, at some length in the book. So you'll have to look there for more detail. Walt had dropped out of high school in Lakewood before Marsh showed up there in 1921. But apparently he had already met and set his cap for her by then. The family story is they met when Walt's neighbor, Roger Bennett, invited some girls down to Nisqually from Dupont for a birthday party. In any case, Walt shows up frequently in Marceline's photo album, and he seemed to be in full but frustrated courtship mode when she went off to nursing school at the University of Washington and later at Tacoma General Hospital. That was a 5-year gig for her, and it's a testament to Walt's ardor that he kept after Mars, despite her dalliances with classmates at the University of Washington. The first in the family to go to college, Marceline went on to get her degree in nursing and a job at the hospital. But the combined factors of the Depression, an excess of nurses, thanks to new nursing schools, and his persistence finally led her to accept Walt, and they were married in the Fort Lewis Chapel in 1931. Excuse me. It is safe to say that Marceline became a full partner in the marriage and the farm, for not only did she become quite literally the chief cook and bottle washer, she became the family's scribe, archivist, policy director, and strategist in the battles with the powers that be that were to come in the next few decades. And when the time came that Walt was felled by poor health, she would step into his boots to take charge of the dairy farm. In the meantime, though, she raised 2 sons, fed the family and the farmhands legendary meals, and slipped away to Dupont periodically to visit family, deliver eggs and corn to Johnson Brothers store for sale, and to gossip with friends. I'll refer you to my book for details of Kenny and Ward's growing up on the farm. Suffice it to say that it wasn't easy, especially with a father who was a firm believer in hard work and in not sparing the rod with his sons. The work was grueling and endless. Walt and Marce hardly ever took time off, even with hired hands around, and they expected no less from their sons. Now, before I go on, I need to thank some of the folks who brought me up to speed on life in Dupont, the Dupont boys, I call them. On a Sunday morning in May 2005, Kenny and I sat down with this motley crew that he'd invited over to swap stories about growing up in and around Dupont. I'm pretty sure you know them and hope that at least some of them are with us tonight. From left to right, Mike Morgan, Bob Grant, Norm Westby, Johnny Mounts, Stan Yaley, Dick Jensen, Dave Morgan, and Denny Forgy. Forgy. Though it was quite a long time ago now, I remember laughing a lot listening to those gentlemen and wondering just how much these boys were pulling my leg as they told me of their exploits and accidents with automobiles, usually their fathers at the time, guns, mostly shotguns, jury-rigged toboggans, and more cars. But that they also told me a lot about the Braget boys, for which I am eternally grateful. Thank you, gentlemen. Kenny and Ward both attended school in Dupont, and before they could drive, they and their Braget cousins, John's children, had to ride old buses with hard wooden seats to and from the last stop on the school bus line. And Stan Yaley, if you can hear me, I know you remember those too. No after-school activities for them. By the time they were driving and had moved on to high school in Lakewood, Kenny and Ward had settled into distinct personalities with different skill sets to match. The more serious student of the two, Kenny got good grades, but his true love was shooting. Obsessed with guns, cap guns, BB guns, 22s, shotguns, since a little kid, Kenny had become an expert marksman, and with friends like Stan Yaley, competed on a nationally recognized small bore rifle team, that would be 22s. Kenny and Stan had begun hunting wildlife early, mostly rabbits with the aid of Stan's nice little beagle hound, ducks, and pigeons. Bird shooting on the flats or at Pigeon Hill would be the love of Kenny's life. Less studious, Ward was much more sociable than his older brother, and became more so when Mr. Canoyer, his middle school shop teacher, introduced him to square dancing and calling. In high school, Ward was all about dances, cars, and girls, according to friends like Johnny Mounts and Bob Grant. Mike Morgan called him one big cowboy with a big flashy belt buckle and boots. And Dave Morgan remembered him as the happiest, jolliest kid you ever saw. Ward loved pulling pranks, often on adults. Johnny told us about a time when his dad, Dan Mounts, left his new car in the farmyard while he went in to talk with his best friend, Walt. Knowing that Dan's love for his car matched Walt's, Ward bounced a BB pellet off a nearby tin roof and yelled something about the car making a nice target. And then he took off. Unlike Kenny, whose temper sometimes matched his father's, Ward mostly avoided his dad during difficult times, but both boys had inherited their father's stubborn streak, for better or for worse. From the stories they told you about being trigger-happy youth, from the stories they told about being trigger-happy youth, ready to shoot anything that moved and quite a few things that didn't, Ken and the boys from Dupont made it sound like you would take your life in your hands to go into the woods around town or up on Hoffman Hill. Going off to shoot, first BB guns and then 22s and shotguns, was everyone's favorite pastime and often a good excuse for sneaking off from school. Boys collected pop and beer bottles off the neighbors' back porches to cash in at Johnson Brothers store for ammunition money, and then went on a traipse around the DuPont company fence and down to the bay, plinking away at everything on 4 feet and 2 wings. More organized hunting occurred as well, of course. Periodically, armed with their shotguns, the boys would climb up on aptly named Pigeon Hill early in the morning. Kenny was becoming legendary for his ability to bring down birds on the wing. When the pigeons quit flying about 9 a.m., the boys would settle in for a wait until the birds returned in the afternoon. As time passed, they began fooling around as boys do, singing songs, laughing, and catcalling to one another across the hillside. Somebody took the barrel off his Winchester Model 12 shotgun and began trumpeting through it. Soon they were all blowing barrels like a bunch of Swiss horns, according to Kenny. Well, now some hunters from Tacoma had taken up position down along the tracks below and out of range of the boys. Apparently, they took offense to the boys' annex, and according to Norm Westby, some crazy fool shot up at us through the maple trees. Before you could say Jack Robinson, the boys returned fire, raining the shot from the 27 shells they had left down on the interlopers. Norm said that all they could hear after that was the sound of crunching cinders as the hunters ran off. Duck hunting on the Braget farm was a more serious affair, especially on opening day, when Walt and his sons took special delight in inviting friends and relatives from Dupont, Lakewood, and Tacoma to join them for the day's sport. Dave Morgan told of invitees showing up early and helping the family clean up the milk house and getting everything ready for the opening of hunting, which officially started at noon. As the time approached, Walt would truck everyone out to the clubhouse, a ramshackle old shack left over from the construction of the railroad back in 1911-12. And then folks would walk out to the blinds to start shooting. Folks like Henry Hansen, a cousin of Walt's, and Buster Minow and the Darcys, Nick and Marge, were regulars. Hunting on the flats with the Bragets was pretty special. I can't tell you which was more important to these boys, guns or cars, but I can tell you that they got their love for automobiles from the previous generation, their fathers and uncles. Walt, for example, had courted Marceline in his pride and joy, a big Buick Roadster with a cutout on the manifold, which when pulled made the Roadster sound like a souped up race car. So everyone knew when he was on his way to visit Marceline in Dupont. Stan Yaley's mom said that you wouldn't want to be out on the road when Walt came through because he didn't leave any grass grow under those tires. Mike Morgan remembered how Walt would stop off farm work when someone showed up with a new car to check it out from stem to stern, much to Marceline's disapproval. He would be under the hood and under the car, and as Mike said, the bigger the car was, the faster it was, the better Walt liked it. Kenny, Ward, and the Dupont boys were equally obsessed with automobiles, and I was amazed at how well they remembered makes and models, colors and modifications of vehicles from so many years ago. Kenny worked hard to become a thorough mechanic, often butting heads with his impatient dad when it took too long to fix an out-of-commission tractor or truck. And both boys spent their time with girls driving the loop in downtown Olympia, like you may remember in the movie American Graffiti. The Braget boys learned to drive at the wheels of farm machinery, usually trucks that collected the hay and bales for storage in the barn. For the boys from Dupont, driver's ed took the form of using their father's cars for tasks like delivering papers for their morning paper routes. After finishing, they would tool around the dirt roads outside the company fence, avoiding the highway because they had no licenses. More than once, they bottomed out on a tree stump hidden in the tall grass and limped home with a disabled car and with their tails between their legs to face a father's wrath. Now, in the next couple of slides, there's pictures of young people. And if anybody recognizes anyone there, please figure out a way to let me know who it is. I found these pictures among the Braget slide collection, or picture collection, and have no idea who they are, but I really like the pictures. Older cars like Model A's had higher clearance, and so the boys would drive them off-road, usually with impunity. And besides, the way they told it, the boys were invincible and apparently impervious to pain. But they did tell of a time when a bunch of them took a shortcut through the Scotch broom and hit a 2-foot stump dead center, wrapping the car's spring bumper right around it and blowing out the radiator. Tom Harden went through the windshield, and according to Norm, who was driving, Dick Jensen's face left a perfect imprint and a bit of his nose in the safety glass. The steering wheel folded up like an umbrella against Norm's chest, bruising him severely. Chuck Harden, who was sitting in the back, got away with a bitten tongue. Guys, when they get together, delight in telling stories of past mishaps and mayhem, and Kenny and the Braget boys were no exception, obviously. Back in their youth, the winters were cold and more snowy, and sledding on the Fort Lewis golf course and skating on the pond there were annual events. One year, some of the boys made a sort of a toboggan out of half a sheet of plywood, 2x8, that was left over from a boat building project. After the dance in town that night, Norm, Dave, and Denny took their toboggan down to the golf course in search of a special dip in the slope around the 14th hole that some other kids had found that day. After much searching, they found it, and then they hid it. Toboggan and boys went separate ways, and there was a mighty crack as Dave Morgan hit the ice of the pond some 40 paces downhill. Norm, who was in front, burst all the buttons off his army jacket, but Dave had suffered a serious break to his leg. His friends splinted him up with a slat from a broken sled, rolled him onto the other half of the sheet of plywood, loaded him into Bert Wyant's 55 Chevy, and took him to St. Joseph Hospital in Tacoma. There, the doctor kindly praised their medical skills, but pointed out that they had splinted the wrong part of Dave's leg. As I said, I laughed a lot at the storytelling that May morning at the Braget farm, but things took a more serious turn when the subject of Wart Braget's death at age 21 came up. As I describe at some length in the book, Ward was lost at sea in this runabout during a severe storm after he went out from the Nisqually River in search of some hunters who had rented a small boat from Walt. Ward and his boat eventually were found where they had come ashore up by the Narrows Bridge. Ward's passing was a huge blow for all 3 members of his family, but perhaps it was most life-changing for Kenny, who at the time was in the Navy and seeing the world. Any thoughts he may have had of Ward taking over from Walt someday, and him, Kenny, making his own life away from the farm were dashed. He came back home and never left. But Ward's passing was also a severe blow to the community, which came out in force to try and find him during the storm. Ward was a very popular guy, and not just with the ladies. Perhaps hardest hit was Bob Grant, who considered Kenny's brother his best friend. When he was 15, Bob's 8-year-old brother had disappeared from Lure Beach, just west of the Nisqually River, probably a victim of the incoming tide. Ward's loss was something that stayed with Bob for years. The somber mood of the Dupont boys didn't last long, and soon they were reminiscing about boats and boat racing, a favorite activity of the Braget men. Then they remembered blowing up what they called warning bombs that they had picked up off the railroad track, and about family gatherings on the Dupont dock on weekends and holidays in the summer. Dungeness crab cooked on the beach over open fires and old beer kegs donated by the tavern, oysters from Lure Beach, gooey ducks, and all the side dishes you can remember or imagine, and undoubtedly some brew and some hooch. Eventually, back on that morning in May, it was time for lunch, on Kenny, of course, at a nearby restaurant. But before we broke up, Dick Jensen summed up what had gone on that morning. He said, "You can tell that all of us have got real good, fond memories of the Braget farm and the Nisqually and Dupont. There's so many more of them from Dupont that aren't here that could tell more stories. I mean, I know my dad, he was born and raised in a tar paper shack here. He worked on the dairies here when he was a young kid and stuff. All those memories, though, all these memories are all gone. And it's something that Kenny is getting this recorded now. Our grandkids can read back and see this stuff. I think it's a real neat deal." It was experiences like talking with the Dupont boys that made all those years of research and interviews and the writing of the book worthwhile. Unfortunately, at least from this vantage point and many years later, the story of the Braget family and farm was not particularly a happy one, especially after Ward's death. Soon thereafter, as I say in the book, the world started paying too close attention to the Nisqually Delta, and a lot was focused on the Braget farm. The arrival of the I-5 freeway and the wildlife refuge across the river, the threats posed by other visions for their land from the port of Tacoma, which wanted to create a super port there, and from the environmental community, which wanted to turn the whole Delta into a park, all nibbled at the land and at the family's peace of mind. Interfamily squabbles added to the impact, as at one point John Braget's children ended up taking Walt to court over the sale of land that they shared to the State Department of Transportation for the freeway. Eventually, even Pierce County and the city of Dupont became Braget adversaries. The runoff from a proposed development just above Mounts Road to the east of the Braget farmhouse, eventually called El Rancho Madrona, threatened both the Braget fields below and the health of Red Salmon Creek, which ran across Braget property and fed into the Nisqually Delta. This occurred only a year or two after the passage of the State Environmental Policy Act, or SEPA, which made counties responsible for environmental impact statements for small development projects. The battle over the runoff from El Rancho Madrona became a test case for Pierce County. With the help of environmentalists like neighbors Dell and Bud McBride, Walt forced the county to have the developers revise their stormwater control plans to protect Red Salmon Creek and the fields. But then the city of Dupont complicated things by first annexing El Rancho Madrona at the request of the developers, and then eventually suggesting to the Bragets that the city also annex their farm. Walt had been shocked by the approach of the city limits so close to the farm and would have nothing to do with that suggestion. The stress and strain and years and years of fending off those who wanted the farm for their own purposes took their toll on the Braget family. Walt was the first to go down, laid low by a massive stroke in 1977. He would spend the rest of his life in a nursing home in Lakewood and die at the age of 77. In the meantime, Morris and Kenny struggled on, now finally accepting the fact that they were going to have to sell the farm, but adamant that it would only be to the right buyer and for the right price. Keeping the farm going with only Kenny and the occasional hired hand to help was very hard on Morris, now well into her 70s. And by the time Walt died in 1983, she had already suffered her own first stroke. Though small, it was a sign of the beginning of her decline. And by 1994, she too was dead. So then Kenny was on his own to complete the final chapters of the story of the Braget farm. As told in the book, he continued to fend off efforts to get it included in the wildlife refuge, harboring a well-deserved distrust of government, and still holding out for a price that reflected his love for the land. In the meantime, Kenny never avoided a good fight, and when the opportunities arose to join in the battles against the powers that be, whether it be sewage treatment at Tatsolo Point for Northwest Landing or Weyerhaeuser's plans to export gravel from the Dupont dock, he jumped right in. Finally, when Kenny began to spend time with the staff of the Natural Resources Department of the Nisqually tribe at watershed planning meetings, he felt that he had found the right buyer. Ultimately, the fact that he could live on the farm for the rest of his life and leave it in the hands of people that he respected, both for their willingness to battle government for their rights and for their love of the land, made all the difference. Thank you. That's it. Carol, I'm ready to talk about questions. You need to unmute, Carol.
So we did have one question. What year was Rancho Madrona built? Do you know?
Oh, I do, but I'm not going to remember it off the top of my head. I certainly can find out if you want to email me, and I'll just put my email in the chat box, and I certainly can tell you, but I don't have it at the top of my head.
So the other question someone is asking is, what is El Rancho Madrona? I'm
sorry if I didn't make that clear. Let me just finish typing, or I will mess it up. El Rancho Madrona is a housing development that's east along Mounts Road between the Braget farm and the golf course, and on the north side of Mounts Road, of about 25 houses, I think, something like that. So it was built on a house on a hillside, and the result is going to be, from the way they planned it initially, that all the runoff from the hard surfaces, the roads and so on, would all come down across Mounts Road and end up in the Braget fields that were right there, and also in worked their way down into Red Salmon Creek, which at the time was literally a salmon creek, but also was fed directly into the Nisqually Delta. And this was pretty much after the major battles of fighting off development in the Delta and protecting it and its water quality for the future.
So we have another question from Jackie Lambert. Do you think the sale of the Braget farm to the Nisqually Indian tribe was motivated by money or the shared environmental appreciation of the land?
Yes. Both. There's no question that Kenny especially, but the whole family saw their land not only as something that they loved and poured their blood, sweat, and tears into, but also as an investment, as the legacy that they could leave. And the unhappiness, of course, was that eventually there were no grandchildren, no children. Neither Kenny nor Thomas Ward had children that they could leave it to. And so I think a very big thing for the family was understanding about how people worked and the importance of hospitality. And one of their issues for years and years with the government folks from the Wildlife Refuge and other governmental agencies were that they were bureaucrats, they weren't neighbors. And the Bragets didn't know how to relate to them very well and didn't like them for their officiousness and the way they went about things. The tribe, because one, Kenny had many friends in the tribe for years and years in the tribe. He knew them well, and he knew of their reverence for land. And he knew that he wanted to figure out how to have it go on in perpetuity, is one of his favorite ways of saying things, as pretty much as is. I mean, he knew that eventually that the dikes would be coming out, but pretty much untouched, not sullied by human presence, more than just the ways it was being used by them. So he was, his favorite statement eventually was, well, if we can't grow cows there, let's grow salmon. So I think both the profit motive and the love for the land were right there in his and his family's consciousness.
Renee Buck asks, in the Dupont boys' stories, were there references to Sequalichi Creek or Edmonds Marsh?
Not to the best of my memory, though. We were trying to talk mostly about the connections between Dupont and the Bragets at the time. So it wouldn't surprise me that those subjects didn't come up, though I'm sure Melanie and I, by the way, took a walk down along the bluff towards Sequalichi Creek. We also did the walk down to the creek, but that walk along the bluff from Sequalichi Creek south or west, as you want to call it, towards the Braget farm, probably was the way those boys often came from Dupont to spend time at the Braget farm and vice versa. So as far as I can remember, they didn't come up. I'm going to make a extended transcript of the Dupont boys interview available to the museum if I haven't already done so. I thought maybe I had. And you can check eventually if it becomes available through the museum.
So, and I've wondered about this several times. As you're going south on I-5, can you tell us anything about the very old houses along I-5 southbound, immediately north of the farm? The homes appear to be abandoned with moss growing on the roofs. Were these homes somehow affiliated with the farm?
No, I don't think so. If you look at the map, you'll see that the farm is centered around Mounts Road, which is really significantly towards the water from the freeway at that point. There was property below them that belonged to the McBrides, Bud and Richard and Delbert McBride and their family, but it's not visible. Their places aren't visible from the freeway. The one that is Johnny Mount's house, which is right adjacent to the freeway, but it's the best of my memory, it does not look dilapidated. I mean, he's still living there, and there's a big metal barn out back. So I don't think it's that you're talking about. That's really close to the freeway because when it came through, his dad refused to allow them to take all of his property and ended up living basically right on the edge of the freeway.
Okay. Renee makes the comment, some of these are Nisqually Land Trust property along Red Salmon Creek.
Yes, the McBrides and others have made their land available to the land trust in one form or another. And the McBrides, unfortunately, of course, both have passed away. And so that's a little while ago that happened. But yes, that's true. That's really great.
Another question from Ralph. Did I hear you say that the railroad grade was built in 1911?
The section that runs from from Nisqually north to Tacoma along the waterfront was constructed, was finished in 1911, I believe is right. Maybe into a little bit into 1912. And that included apparently a lot of fill, especially south of the Braget farm towards Nisqually. And there's some wonderful evidence, photographic evidence of that in the Lacey Museum's collection of how they drove out, built great scaffolding and drove out on the end of it, railroad cars, and dumped dirt off the end and things like that. But yes, there's a plaque on the underpass, or over the trains overpassing the road down at the bottom of Mounts Road below the Braget farmhouse that has 1911 on it. And the evidence that I saw from many resources all talk about it being built at that time.
So are there any walking trails down around the Braget farm there? I know you can walk on Mounts Road, but
basically not, because as we said, the land was sold to the tribe, and they have not developed it for public use. It's very much for tribal use, and all sorts of wonderful things are happening there, but there aren't any trails on that side that I'm aware of yet, anyway, for public use. It is the tribe is basically co-managing it with the refuge as part of a larger refuge area, but it still definitely belongs to them.
okay. So was it the Weyerhaeuser Company that sought to construct a deep water port near the Nisqually Delta in the 1970s?
That's a very dangerous question, because we don't have enough time to answer that. No, it was not. It was the Port of Tacoma. They in the 70s wanted to, were afraid that their facilities in Tacoma would not be sufficient and able to handle a whole line of new super tankers that were being built in Japan, at least originally, that were really huge, bigger than anything that had been done before. And these were probably all for petroleum. But they decided that they wanted to build a superport in Nisqually. At the same time, the efforts to develop the wildlife refuge and all that were ongoing. So a very complex process. But they actually came to the Bragets. Walt was then in charge, in good health, and offered them, according to Kenny, $1 million to sell their farm to the port. And they refused, but not until after Kenny and his father had a fist fight over what to do. Walt at that point had been milking cows for 60 years and was very anxious to stop. And Kenny was just getting started and didn't want to see this sale happen. So according to Kenny's story anyway, he saved the day by convincing his father not to sell. And ultimately, the combined efforts of the Department of Game, who had other ideas, the Tahoma Audubon Society that stepped in and played a big role in developing the environmental consciousness, the Bragets, and even the U.S. Fish and Wildlife all teamed up against the Port of Tacoma, and eventually they stopped thinking it was a good idea.
Do you know if the sale of the land included the farming implements or just the land buildings?
Before the sale of the land took place or was complete, they had a major sale on the property, and all the contents of the barns, the implements, there were boats, there were leftover motorcycles. Kenny and especially was into old motorcycles, vehicles of various kinds. All was sold as at auction, and also including Kenny's extensive collection of firearms, mostly for birding, but he was also into black powder shooting, and so there was all of that there too. But definitely it was all sold out.
So when I read the book, you mentioned in the book something about a little town called Sherlock.
Yes,
Can you tell me where that was located?
more or less where Nisqually is now. And sometimes if you sometimes it's hard to figure out where Nisqually is, but you actually can find a center if you drive around enough. There's a big sign that says Nisqually, but it's sort of between the Braget property and the Nisqually Reservation proper. And at one point, there was another railroad line. Well, I guess it still is, but that runs off along the freeway now from out of there, and that connected to what was then Sherlock Station, a railroad station. But it was a town that was created by the railroad company in hopes of it becoming a major place. And along with things like Nisqually City, which is a whole nother story of fun, it didn't really ever come into being. But I never did learn why it was called Sherlock, but it fairly quickly disappeared. And eventually that area became called Nisqually.
And since you mentioned Nisqually City, was that going to go in, or did they plan to build that where Fort Lewis Golf Course is?
Yes, I think that would have been the southern end of it. It was definitely it was supposed to be on the coastal edge of the prairie, pretty much north from about where the golf course is. And this was a scheme developed by a number of scheming developers out of Tacoma. Among them, Colonel Frank Ross is a very famous guy. But they convinced Daniel Mounts, who originally owned the property where the Fort Lewis Golf Course is, to donate land or put land into this as an investment. And this was in about the 1880s, as I remember. And it was to be they called it the Philadelphia of the West. It was supposed to be the huge, wonderful development. And along came the Depression of 1893. I think I have that right. And it all fell apart, and everybody lost their investments, and except Frank Ross, who had a way of setting things up so he wouldn't. But so a number of members of the Mounts family had already moved there as first folks in the platted part of it, and they lost everything. It was one of several times that those members of his family lost their things. They lost things to their housing and land to the freeway as well, and to Mount Martin Way when it went through. So anyway, that's where it was. It was a glorious adventure with no skin off the developers. It was all a loss at local level.
Okay, so I don't see any more questions in the chat box. I am, if it's all right with you, Tim, I am going to give everybody your email address just in case they have questions for you or have comments for you.
Absolutely.
So it's Timothy Ransom at Comcast.net.
And Ransom is Ransom.
Right. Mm-hmm. So I don't see any more questions, and so thank you very much. We very much appreciate. And I do want to let everybody know that if you haven't read the book for the good of the order, I very much enjoyed it, especially the last part of it where I didn't realize all the trials and that the Braget family went through in trying to protect their property. But I also want to let you know that the book is available at the Dupont Museum. And you can either purchase it, come in and purchase it, or we'll be happy to mail it to you if you send us an email.
Carol, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much for this opportunity. And again, I wish I was in the room with you all, shake some hands, but thank you all for coming.
Well, maybe once all of this gets cleared up, we'll have you come back and do it in person, okay?
Sure, happy to.
All right.
And don't forget, we did record it, so that'll be available too.
And I want to thank everybody for coming on and participating and also supporting us in this venture. So thank you.
Thank you.